My name is Eleonora. I'm 71 years old, and what I'm about to tell you began with the cold, unforgiving shock of river water in my lungs. Just an hour ago, my stepdaughter Isla and her husband Leo pushed my husband Arthur and me from the old ironwood bridge. The fall felt like an eternity, a dizzying spiral of wind and sky before the violent impact stole my breath. As the current dragged me under, into the crushing darkness, I felt a hand grasp mine. It was Arthur. Through the roar of the water, his voice was a desperate, gurgling whisper in my ear. "Eleonora, stay still! Let them think we drowned!" That single command was the only thing that cut through the terror. The instinct to fight, to thrash my way to the surface, was immense, but his grip was like an anchor to sanity. We let the river carry us, two limp forms tossed about like fallen leaves, until the current finally deposited us onto a muddy bank downstream, hidden by a thicket of weeping willows. Lying there, gasping, my lungs burning and my body a symphony of blossoming bruises, I stared at my husband, the man I had loved for 30 years. But the physical pain was nothing. The worst part came after, when we were safe, when he finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a guilt that terrified me more than the fall itself, because it was there, on that cold patch of earth, that he told me a truth that hurt more than the fall itself. Before I dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing more. For 30 years, Arthur and I had built what I believed was a fortress of love and trust. He was a widower when we met, his heart still heavy with the loss of his first wife, and his hands full with their 5-year-old daughter, Isla. I fell in love with his quiet strength, his gentle hands that could fix anything, and the sadness in his eyes that I yearned to soothe. And I fell in love with Isla. I never tried to replace her mother. I only wanted to be a source of comfort, a steady presence in her life. I read her bedtime stories, braided her hair, and held her when she had nightmares. I thought we had built a real family. Our home was a place of warmth, the scent of baking bread mingling with the smell of wood polish from Arthur's workshop. He was a master carpenter, and our house was filled with his creations. The sturdy dining table where we shared our meals, the rocking chair where I'd sung Isla to sleep, the intricately carved bed frame we shared. Life was a quiet, beautiful melody. Isla, by then married to Leo, a man with a charming smile and eyes that never seemed to settle, visited often. At first, I was touched by their concern. They would bring groceries, help with the gardening, and sit with us for hours, listening to our stories. "We just want to make sure you're both taken care of," Isla would say, her hand resting on mine. Her touch, which once felt like a comfort, had started to feel possessive. The questions began subtly. "Do you think this big house is too much for you to manage?" Leo asked one afternoon, his eyes scanning the living room, lingering on the antique clock Arthur had restored. "You know, the property taxes must be a fortune," Isla would add, her voice laced with a sweetness that now seems venomous. They spoke of downsizing, of moving us into a more manageable apartment, of helping us organize our finances. I brushed it off as misplaced concern. I'd look at Arthur, and he would give me a small, reassuring smile, but I see now that his eyes were troubled. He knew something he wasn't telling me. Have you ever felt that creeping unease, that feeling when someone's kindness starts to feel like a cage? The dread began as a whisper in the back of my mind. I noticed small things. An expensive new watch on Leo's wrist, a designer handbag Isla carried, trips they took that seemed beyond the means of his modest salary as an accountant. When I gently inquired, they had plausible explanations, a year-end bonus, savvy investments. I wanted to believe them. I would ask Arthur if he thought it was strange, and he would grow quiet. "They're adults, Elle," he'd say. "We have to trust them." The pressure intensified about 6 months ago when they suggested we grant them power of attorney. "It's just a precaution," Leo explained, his tone smooth as polished wood. "In case something happens, we can make sure your bills are paid and everything is handled without any legal mess." I hesitated. "We're perfectly capable of managing our own affairs," I told them, my voice firmer than I expected. I saw a flicker of something in Isla's eyes then, a brief, cold flash of annoyance that was quickly masked by a wounded expression. "We were only trying to help," she murmured, turning away. That was the first time I felt a genuine shiver of fear. I looked to Arthur for support, but he was staring out the window, his jaw tight. He was silent. His silence felt like a betrayal long before the one on the bridge. It wasn't just about money or property, it was about control. They wanted to control our lives, our decisions, our future. And now, lying on this cold, muddy riverbank, the truth was brutally clear. They didn't just want control. They wanted everything. They wanted us gone. The fall from the bridge wasn't a sudden, impulsive act. It was the final step in a meticulously planned campaign. They had been leading us to this moment for months, perhaps years. Every loving gesture, every concerned word, was a lie. Arthur shivered beside me, his face pale in the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a terror that mirrored my own, but also with something else, something deeper and more painful: regret. "We have to be smart, Eleonora," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They'll come looking. They'll want to make sure the job is done." The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. This wasn't over. For them, our drowning was just the beginning. For us, survival meant entering a nightmare where the monsters wore the faces of our family. We were alone, injured, and hunted. And I was beginning to realize that my own husband was hiding a secret that was just as dangerous as the one his daughter was trying to bury. I remember the day I first met Arthur. He was in his workshop, sanding a small rocking horse, its paint worn from years of use. He looked up, and his eyes, full of a quiet sadness, met mine. "This was my wife's," he said, his voice soft. "I'm fixing it for Isla." In that moment, I saw the depth of his love and his loss, and I knew I wanted to be the person who helped bring light back into his life. I never imagined that the shadows of his past would one day rise up and try to drown us both. Was I wrong to believe that our love could conquer any history, any secret? I poured my heart into building our family. I learned to cook the dishes Isla's mother used to make. I hung her photographs alongside my own family's, and I always spoke of her with the reverence she deserved. For years, it seemed to work. Isla called me Mom. She brought me handmade cards on Mother's Day, and when she scraped her knee, it was my name she cried out. Arthur would watch us, a small, peaceful smile on his face. I thought we had healed him. I thought we had built something new and strong together. I see now that our family was built on a fault line, and Arthur knew exactly where the cracks were. I just couldn't see them. The first tremor I felt was on Isla's 16th birthday. Arthur had gifted her a simple, elegant pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. Isla opened the velvet box, looked at the pearls, and her smile was thin. "They're nice," she said, before setting the box aside to open another gift. Later that night, I mentioned it to Arthur. "She seemed disappointed," I said. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "It's complicated, Elle. She's always felt like she's living in her mother's shadow." He said it with a finality that discouraged further questions. I accepted it, trusting him. I didn't realize he was actively hiding the truth from me, not just protecting his daughter's feelings. The quiet dread that began that night became a low hum in the background of our lives. It was there in the way Isla would compare my cooking to her mother's, and Arthur would remain silent, never defending me. It was in the way she'd correct his stories of his youth, saying, "No, Dad, Mom told me it happened this way." And he would just nod, a pained look on his face. He was letting her build a mythology around a mother she barely remembered, a perfect, sainted figure that I, a living, breathing, imperfect woman, could never compete with. And he was my co-conspirator through his silence. The arrival of Leo seemed, at first, like a blessing. He was attentive to Isla, charming to us. He validated Isla's narrative about her perfect mother. "Your mother sounded like an incredible woman," he'd say to her, his hand on her back. "Eleonora has done a wonderful job, of course, but it's not the same, is it?" He said it with such casual cruelty, masked as empathy. I would look at Arthur, expecting him to object, to say, "Eleonora is my wife, and this is her home." But he would just sit there, his hands clasped on the table, a silent statue of a man. He nurtured the resentment in Isla with his passivity, allowing Leo to water it with his false sympathy until it grew into a poisonous vine that choked everything else. Our home, which had once felt like our shared sanctuary, began to feel like occupied territory. They would rearrange furniture without asking. They went through his workshop, his sacred space, deciding what to sell. "We're just helping you clear out the clutter," Isla explained, and Arthur would just nod. "Yes, dear, whatever you think is best." It wasn't clutter, it was his soul, and he was letting her dismantle it piece by piece. The dread was no longer a hum, it was a roar. I confronted him one night, my voice shaking with a frustration I could no longer contain. "Why do you let her do this, Arthur? Why do you let them walk all over us?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep, ancient sadness. "It's the only way I know how to keep her," he said. "If I fight her, I'll lose her. She's all I have left of her mother." The words were a punch to the gut. She's all I have left of her mother. And what was I? A placeholder? A consolation prize? It was in that moment I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that his love for his daughter and his guilt over his first wife's death had blinded him. He was so afraid of losing Isla that he was willing to sacrifice our peace, our dignity, and as it turns out, our lives. He had been choosing her over me, in small ways, for years. And that choice had led us directly to the edge of that bridge. Arthur pulled me further into the shelter of the willows, his movements slow and pained. He had a deep gash on his forehead, and I could tell from the way he was breathing that he had broken a rib. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "They might circle back." We huddled together for warmth, the damp chill from our clothes seeping into our bones. The silence between us was heavy, not just with the horror of what Isla had done, but with the weight of the 30 years of questions I now had for him. "You knew," I whispered, the words tasting like river mud. "You knew she was capable of something like this." He didn't look at me. He stared out at the dark water, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of the town. "I knew she was troubled," he finally said, his voice broken. "I knew she was greedy, but not this. I never imagined this." "That's not what I asked," I pressed, my voice gaining a hard edge I didn't recognize. "I asked if you knew. Tell me the truth, Arthur. For once, tell me the whole truth." He finally turned to me, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The guilt I had seen earlier was now a raw, open wound. "Yes," he whispered. "I knew. Not everything, but enough. I've known for a very long time." The confession hung in the air, a quiet indictment of our entire marriage. "When?" My voice cracked. "How?" "It started years ago," he began, his voice dropping lower, as if the trees themselves were listening. "Isla! She found her mother's diaries not long after we were married. I never told you about them. I thought it would be too painful. Her mother, she wasn't the saint Isla makes her out to be. She was deeply unhappy, she felt trapped, and she had a secret." He took a shaky breath. "Her parents were very wealthy. They set up a trust fund for Isla, a massive one. But the terms were cruel. She couldn't get it until she was 40 or—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Or upon the death or legal incapacitation of your subsequent spouse." I finished for him, the words feeling alien in my mouth. "You!" His head dropped in a slow, defeated nod. "How long have you known about this?" I asked, my heart turning to ice. "For almost 25 years," he admitted, his voice barely audible. I found the trust documents by accident not long after her mother died. I confronted her parents. They said they were protecting their daughter's inheritance from a small-town carpenter. They didn't trust me. Each word was another crack in the foundation of the life I thought I knew. He had been carrying this secret, this poison, throughout our entire marriage. Every decision, every placating gesture towards Isla was colored by this knowledge. "Why, Arthur?" I cried. The betrayal of physical pain now, sharper than any broken bone. "Why would you keep this from me?" "To protect you," he insisted, his voice rising with a desperate edge. "I didn't want you to live in fear. I didn't want you to look at that little girl and see a threat. I thought if I loved her enough, if I gave her everything she wanted, she would forget about it. I thought I could manage it. I thought I could protect our family." He had tried to build a dam to hold back a flood, and in the end, the flood had washed us both away. This was the truth that hurt more than the fall. It wasn't just that our stepdaughter was a monster. It was that my husband, the man I trusted with my life, had known about the monster and chose to feed it in silence, hoping it wouldn't devour us. He reached into the inner pocket of his soaked coat, his fingers fumbling with the cold, wet fabric. He pulled out a small, tarnished brass key, attached to a simple leather fob. Her mother's diaries, the trust papers. I hid them. Years ago. "In a lockbox in the attic," he said, pressing the cold metal into my palm. "I was so afraid that if Isla found them, it would activate something in her. I see now, my hiding them just made it worse. It made it a prize to be won." The key felt impossibly heavy in my hand. It was a key to a past he had hidden, a secret he had carried alone, a secret that had almost gotten us killed. A cold, hard resolve began to form in my heart, displacing some of the pain. "We have to get back to the house," I said, my voice steady for the first time since the fall. "We have to get to that box before they do." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for forgiveness. But forgiveness was a luxury we couldn't afford right now. First, we had to survive. Getting back to the house was an exercise in pure adrenaline and terror. We moved through the backwoods, Arthur leaning on me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a fresh spike of fear through me. The 2-mile walk felt like 100. My body screamed in protest, but the weight of the key in my pocket was a constant, urgent reminder of our purpose. The house was dark when we finally arrived, a silent silhouette against the moonless sky. It looked just as we had left it, a beacon of safety that now felt like the most dangerous place on Earth. What would you do in that situation? Risk going into the one place your attackers think you'll never reach again? We slipped in through the back door to the cellar, a door Arthur always kept unlocked out of habit, a habit I had scolded him for 100 times. Tonight, it was our salvation. The air in the house was still and cold. It tasted of betrayal. Every familiar object, the coat rack holding Leo's jacket, the half-empty glass of water Isla left on the counter, was a monument to their deception. We moved like ghosts through our own home, our stockinged feet silent on the hardwood floors. Arthur led the way to the attic, his hand on the small of my back, a gesture that was once comforting but now felt complicated, heavy with unspoken history. The attic was just as it always was, a dusty sanctuary of forgotten things. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and cedar. I held a small flashlight, its beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness, dancing over stacks of old magazines, discarded furniture, and boxes sealed with yellowed tape. "It's behind the old steamer trunk," Arthur whispered, his breath fogging in the cold air. We found it tucked away in a dark corner, a heavy, steel lockbox, its surface coated in a fine layer of dust. His hands trembled as he took the key from my pocket. It slid into the lock with a soft, metallic click that echoed in the oppressive silence. The lid creaked open. Inside, nestled on top of a stack of yellowed legal documents, were two things that I had never seen: a small, leather-bound diary and a bundle of letters tied with a faded silk ribbon. The letters were from Isla's mother, written in a delicate, looping script. The diary was hers as well, and beneath them was the trust agreement. Arthur picked it up, his hands shaking, and showed me the clause. The stark, unforgiving print that named me as the sole obstacle between Isla and a fortune I never knew existed. The shock, even though he had already told me, was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. This was proof. Proof of his secret, and proof of her motive. It was the story of our family, written in cold legal ink. The danger you can't see is always the most terrifying. He never saw the cliff's edge coming, and neither do most people. Subscribe right now so you aren't caught off guard by the dangers hiding in plain sight. I picked up the small diary. The entries were sporadic, written in the months before her death. They were not the words of the sainted, perfect woman Isla described. They were the words of a woman who was deeply unhappy, who felt trapped in her marriage, who spoke of Arthur's quiet nature not as strength, but as a suffocating passivity. One entry, dated just a week before she died, in what was ruled a single car accident, was circled in red ink. He doesn't fight for me. He doesn't fight for anything. He just accepts. If I want a different life, I have to be the one to burn the old one down. The money is my only way out. My parents made sure of that. My mind reeled. The perfect mythology Isla had built around her mother was a fantasy. This was the woman Arthur had been trying to protect me from, the ghost he had allowed to haunt our house for 30 years. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine cut through the night, growing louder as it approached the house. Headlights swept across the attic window, throwing our shadows into sharp relief against the dusty rafters. Arthur grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. "They're back!" he breathed, his voice tight with panic. We heard the car doors slam shut. The sound of their voices, Isla's sharp and anxious, Leo's a low, placating rumble, drifted up from below. They were talking about the bridge, about the current, about how no one could have survived. "We need to find the key, Leo!" Isla's voice was sharp, cutting through the floorboards. "Dad must have hidden it somewhere. Without that box, it's all for nothing." They were in the house. They were looking for the very thing I held in my hands. We were trapped in the attic, with the evidence of their crime, and the murderers themselves just one floor below us. The creak of the front door opening sent a new wave of terror through me. They were inside, and they were coming for the truth. The sound of their footsteps on the main floor was a death knell. Each creak of the floorboards below was a countdown. We were trapped, cornered animals in the dusty darkness of the attic. I extinguished the flashlight, plunging us into absolute blackness. My heart hammered against my ribs, so loud I was sure they could hear it. I clutched the lockbox to my chest, its cold metal a stark contrast to the heat of my panic. Arthur stood beside me, his breathing shallow, his body tense. "Check his workshop first," Isla commanded. "He was always hiding things in there. Financial statements, old deeds. If he had the key, it would be with his important papers." Her voice was cold, clinical. The loving, grieving daughter was gone, replaced by a ruthless strategist. This was the real Isla, the one Arthur had seen glimpses of, the one he had tried to appease and hide from me. We listened as they ransacked the workshop, the clatter of metal tools and the thud of wooden drawers being pulled out and thrown aside. The sounds of destruction were a desecration of my husband's sacred space. They found nothing. "It's not here," Leo's frustrated voice echoed up the stairs. "Where else could it be?" There was a long pause. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. I could almost hear the gears turning in Isla's mind. Then, her voice, closer now, at the bottom of the attic stairs. "The attic." My breath caught in my throat. Arthur's hand found mine in the dark, his grip a desperate silent communication. They were coming. We scrambled behind the old steamer trunk, pressing ourselves into the corner, trying to melt into the shadows. The pull-down ladder to the attic groaned in protest as Leo lowered it. Light from the hallway flooded the space, illuminating swirling dust motes. A moment later, his head appeared, then his shoulders. He scanned the attic, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. My entire body was rigid with the effort of staying still, of not making a sound. He took a step into the attic, then another. He was just feet away from us. I could smell his cologne, a scent I once associated with polite family dinners. Now it smelled like death. He didn't see us. He moved towards a stack of boxes on the far side of the room, his back to us. This was our chance. A choice had to be made, right then, in that split second. Do we wait for them to find us, or do we face them? Do you think I was right to wait, or should I have screamed for help the second he entered the attic? Let me know your thoughts. Just as Leo began to rummage through a box, Isla's voice called up from the hallway. Find anything? Just dust and spiders, he grumbled. Are you sure it's up here? It has to be, she insisted. It's the last place left. That was it. I couldn't hide anymore. It was Arthur who moved first. He stepped out from behind the trunk, a silent, imposing figure despite his injuries. Isla, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a father's broken heart. Leo spun around, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His eyes widened in disbelief, as if he were seeing a ghost. Down below, Isla gasped. I stepped out from behind Arthur, holding the lockbox. Isla's face appeared in the opening of the attic. The color drained from her cheeks. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The mask was gone. All that was left was the raw, ugly face of her greed and hatred. Dad, she finally stammered. You're alive. No thanks to you, I snapped, my voice dripping with venom. Leo was the first to recover. A dark, dangerous look replaced the shock in his eyes. He saw not a resurrected father, but a witness, a problem that had not been solved. You shouldn't have come back, he said, his voice a low growl. He started to move towards us, his intentions clear. He wanted the box. He wanted to finish what they started on the bridge. But as he lunged, he underestimated his father-in-law. Arthur, the quiet, passive man, met his charge. He used Leo's momentum against him, shoving him sideways into a stack of old furniture. While they grappled, Isla scrambled up the ladder into the attic, her face twisted into a snarl of desperation. Give me that box, you old fool, she shrieked, clawing at me. We struggled for it, a grotesque fight in the dusty half-light. This was not a fight for a box of papers anymore. It was a fight for our lives, for the truth, for the very idea of family. She was stronger than me, her fingers like talons digging into my arms. But Arthur shouted from across the room, Eleonora, the police, call them. As I fumbled for my phone, Isla saw her chance. She let go of the box and shoved me with all her might. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall hard. The lockbox flew from my hands, skidding across the floor and coming to rest at her feet. She smiled, a triumphant, ugly sneer. She had won. But as she bent to pick it up, Arthur, having shoved Leo away, threw himself in front of her. No more, Isla, he panted, his hand on his injured ribs. It's over. For a moment, she looked at her father, standing between her and her fortune. And in her eyes, I saw not a flicker of love or recognition, only annoyance. She saw just one more obstacle. The attic, once a quiet repository of memories, became a chaotic battlefield. Isla, seeing her father as the final barrier, screamed in frustration and tried to push past him. Get out of my way, she shrieked, her voice raw with a lifetime of perceived injustices. It's mine. It was always meant to be mine. The confrontation between father and daughter was a brutal, heartbreaking sight. The man who had spent 30 years appeasing her, protecting her, was now physically holding her back from the very prize he had hidden. Leo had recovered and was starting towards them, a look of murderous intent on his face. In that moment, I knew this was the end. They would not make the same mistake twice. But then, a sound from my pocket cut through the chaos. My phone, which I had managed to dial to 911, had connected. A dispatcher's voice, tinny and distant but clear, echoed in the room. 911. What's your emergency? For a split second, everyone froze. Leo's eyes darted towards the attic opening, a flicker of panic finally breaking through his rage. That single moment of hesitation was all Arthur needed. He shoved Isla away from him with a final, desperate burst of energy. She stumbled backward, tripping over a stack of old books and crashing to the floor. Leo, hearing the dispatcher's voice again, made his decision. He scrambled back down the ladder, and a moment later, we heard the front door slam open and the sound of running footsteps. He was abandoning her. The coward was saving himself. Isla pushed herself up, her eyes wild. She looked from her father to the attic opening, her mind racing. Then she ran, not for the box, but for the ladder, scrambling down it like a frightened animal. We were left alone in the attic, panting, our bodies shaking, the heavy lockbox lying between us on the floor. The quiet that descended was more jarring than the violence. A few minutes later, the air was filled with the piercing wail of sirens, growing closer and closer until they stopped right outside our house. The flashing blue and red lights painted surreal patterns across the attic window. The police found Isla hiding in the garden shed, covered in dirt and cobwebs. They found Leo 2 miles down the road, trying to hitch a ride out of town. The sight of them in handcuffs, their faces sullen and defeated, brought me no satisfaction, only a profound, bottomless sadness for the man standing beside me, who had just watched his only child be taken away in disgrace. The hours that followed were a blur of police officers, paramedics, and detectives. Our house was cordoned off with yellow tape, turning our home into a crime scene. I gave my statement in the back of an ambulance, watching as they tended to Arthur's injuries. The detective, a woman named Miller, with tired but kind eyes, listened patiently as we recounted everything, from the bridge to the attic. When we finished, Arthur handed her the lockbox. "The motive is in here," he said, his voice hollow, "and so are my mistakes." Detective Miller spent the next hour reading the letters, the diary, and the trust agreement. When she looked up, her expression was grim. "This is premeditated, attempted murder for financial gain," she said. "The trust agreement is ironclad. They couldn't touch that money as long as you both were alive and well." But then she told us something that made the betrayal cut even deeper. "We pulled their financial records on the way over. They weren't just in debt, they were drowning in it. Leo lost his job 6 months ago and never told anyone. They have liens on their car, their house is in foreclosure, and they owe a significant amount of money to some very unsavory private lenders." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about greed for a future inheritance. It was about a desperate, immediate need for cash. Our death wasn't just a convenience for them. It was a frantic, last-ditch solution to a life that was falling apart. She never saw the real danger coming, and that's a fear many of us live with. We trust the people closest to us, never imagining the secrets they keep. If you believe in staying one step ahead of the unexpected, subscribe to this channel. You don't want to be caught off guard when the truth finally comes out. Detective Miller then showed us another file. "While you were talking, my team did a preliminary search of their home. We found this." She handed me a printout of our bank statement. There were dozens of small electronic transfers to an unknown account over the last year, totaling nearly $50,000. "Leo's an accountant," Miller explained. "He likely set up a ghost account and has been siphoning funds from you for months. He was good enough to cover his tracks so the bank wouldn't flag it." They weren't just waiting for us to die. They were actively stealing from us while they smiled in our faces, while they brought us groceries and told us they loved us. I looked at Arthur. His face was a mask of grief. The meticulous planning, the sheer cold-bloodedness of it all, was staggering. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, it felt like it had unwritten our entire life. The family we thought we had, the love we thought we'd nurtured, it was all a lie. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale gray light over our taped-off house, Detective Miller closed her notebook. "We have them," she said, her voice firm. "They're turning on each other already. He's blaming her greed. She's blaming his desperation. They'll both go to prison for a very long time." The words should have been a comfort. Justice was coming. But as I looked at my home, now violated and cold, and at my husband, whose heart was broken in a way I couldn't imagine. I didn't feel relief. I felt empty. The monsters had been captured, but they had left behind a wreckage that I wasn't sure we could ever rebuild. The 6 months leading up to the trial were a different kind of survival. The physical wounds healed, Arthur's ribs mended, and the gash on his forehead faded to a pale scar. But the emotional wounds, for both of us, only festered. My house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum. Every room held a ghost. I saw Isla at the dinner table, smiling her false smile. I saw Leo in the garden, offering to pull weeds while he was really planting seeds of betrayal. We sold the house. We couldn't stay there. We couldn't breathe in the same air that had been contaminated by so many lies, both theirs and our own. We moved into a small, quiet apartment, rebuilding a life out of the rubble. But the space between us was vast, filled with the silence of Arthur's 25-year-old secret. The trial was a media sensation. The bridge betrayal, the local news called it. Every day, we had to walk past a gauntlet of reporters. Arthur would hold my hand, his grip tight, a silent plea for a unity I wasn't sure we still had. Inside the courtroom, the air was cold and sterile. We sat together and forced ourselves to look at them. Isla and Leo sat at the defendant's table, separated by their lawyers. They never looked at each other. They looked thinner, paler. But when Isla finally looked at her father, I saw no remorse in her eyes. There was only a cold, hard resentment. It was the look of someone who had been caught, not someone who was sorry. The prosecution laid out the case with chilling precision. They presented the lockbox, the diary, the trust agreement. They showed the jury the forged bank statements. They played the recording of my frantic 911 call from the attic. But the most damning piece of evidence was something new. The police had found Isla's personal laptop. On it, they discovered a digital diary. For months, she had been meticulously planning what she called the final solution. She researched river currents and weather patterns. She detailed how they would feign grief and how they would use the inheritance to start a new life. One entry, written the day before they pushed us, was read aloud by the prosecutor. His voice was steady, but the words filled the courtroom with a sickening chill. Tomorrow, their story finally ends. My father thinks his weakness is love. The fool. He has no idea that every smile has been a curse. By this time tomorrow, I will be free. The jury stared at her, their faces a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Isla just stared straight ahead, her expression a mask of indifference. When it was Arthur's turn to testify, the entire courtroom held its breath. He walked slowly to the stand, a man aged a decade and 6 months. He had to testify against his own child. He spoke of his first wife's unhappiness, of the secret trust, of his fear and his guilt. He confessed to the jury, and to me, that his silence had enabled his daughter's darkness to grow. I thought I was protecting my family, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. But I was just a coward, and my cowardice almost cost my wife her life. When I took the stand, I told them everything. I spoke of Arthur's love, but also of his secrets. I spoke of my hope for a family, of the quiet, creeping dread, and the final brutal betrayal on the bridge. When I was done, the prosecutor asked me one last question. Mrs. Vance, after everything, is there anything you want to say to your husband? I turned and looked at Arthur. His eyes were filled with a pain that mirrored my own. I love you, I said, my voice shaking but clear. But trust, once broken, is the hardest thing in the world to rebuild, and our work has just begun. I walked back to my seat, my heart aching with a grief that was deeper than any I had ever known. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict was guilty. Guilty on all counts. They were sentenced to life in prison, with no possibility of parole. As they were led away in handcuffs, Isla looked back at her father one last time. There was no anger, no sadness. There was just nothing. An absolute, chilling void. It has been a year since the trial. The seasons have turned, the world has moved on. But for Arthur and me, time has been measured differently. We mark it in small victories. The first time he spoke of Isla without his voice breaking. The first time I walked by a river without my heart seizing in my chest. The first time we laughed together. A real, genuine laugh that didn't feel like a betrayal of our sorrow. We live in a small cottage by the sea now, miles away from the town that holds so many ghosts. The salty air feels clean, like it can wash away the past. We sold everything. We kept only a few photographs and one of his old, worn work shirts that still smells faintly of sawdust. The money, both ours and the fortune from the secret trust, sits in an account, untouched. It feels tainted. A prize won from a battle we never wanted to fight. What would you do with money that came from such a tragedy? Some people have told me to donate it all, to wash my hands of it. Others say we should live a life of luxury, that we've earned it. If you're still on the fence about subscribing, let me know in the comments what's holding you back. Your perspective might just change my mind. This morning, I walked along the beach, watching the waves roll in and out. Arthur was a few paces behind me, giving me space, as he often does now. He's learning that love isn't about protection, it's about partnership. It isn't about hiding the truth, but facing it together, no matter how ugly it is. For the longest time, I was terrified of water. But here, watching the vast, open ocean, it feels different. It feels like power, but also like peace. The river tried to swallow us, to pull us down into darkness. But the ocean reminds me that even after the most violent storm, the water eventually finds its calm. It reminds me that survival isn't just about not drowning. It's about learning to breathe again on the shore. Arthur finally caught up to me, and his hand found mine. It didn't feel heavy with secrets anymore. It felt like home. A home we are slowly, carefully rebuilding. Isla tried to write our ending, but she failed. She didn't realize that our story was more than just her chapter of hate. There were chapters of love before her, and there will be chapters of healing after. The truth, I've learned, is like the current of a river. You can try to dam it up, to divert it, to hide it in a dusty box in an attic, but eventually, it will find a way through. It will wear down the strongest walls and wash away the most intricate lies. My stepdaughter and my husband both tried to hide the truth from me. One did it with hate, the other with a misguided love. But both learned that the truth cannot be drowned. It will always find its way to the surface. The moral of my story is this: a secret kept, even for the sake of love, is a poison that weakens the foundation of a family from within. True strength isn't found in shielding those you love from the truth, but in having the courage to face it with them, side by side. What is the biggest lesson you've taken from this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might just help someone else who is learning to breathe again.